Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast, Vernacular Architecture, Chapter 2, The Definition of the Field. It is challenging to define vernacular architecture. However, mentioning the characteristic parts of some well-known academic definitions here can help us understand their scope. In Encyclopedia of the Vernacular Architecture of the World, Paul Oliver says, related to their environmental context and available resources, they are customarily owned or community-built structures utilizing traditional technologies, and it includes the collective wisdom and experience of a society and the norms that have become accepted by the group as being appropriate to its built environment. In another source, Dwelling, the Vernacular House Worldwide, Oliver also believes it is the architecture of the people, by the people, but not for the people. In Built to Meet Needs, Amos Rappaport tells all types of buildings made by people in the tribal, folk, peasant, and popular societies, whereas an architect or special designer is not employed. And Nezar al-Sayed thinks they were produced without the need for imported components and processes built by the individuals who occupy it. Also, according to Marcel Vellinga, the field is a more dynamic approach that explicitly focuses on building traditions rather than buildings. In another definition, Del Upton says, "My preference is to define vernacular architecture not as a category into which some buildings may be fit and others not, but as an approach to architectural studies that complements more traditional architectural historical inquiries." Finally, it is essential to remember that the Vernacular Architecture Forum acknowledges that there have been and continue to be debates on defining vernacular architecture. Evaluating what we have at hand helps construct this study's definition. As the first rule, no professional designer is to be in charge, whether an architect, carpenter, or bricklayer. Second, the needs of the local climate must be met. Third, the solution must collaborate with the local socioeconomic and cultural identity. Furthermore, locally available materials should be utilized through traditional building techniques inherited from ancestors. Therefore, this study's definition of vernacular architecture can be as follows: the architectural activity presented in a geography over locally available materials and experience technique, collaborating with local climate and running the cultural values, however, without the employment of a professional designer. According to this study, vernacular architecture is valuable for its principles, not its form. Though all these definitions, there are still common misconceptions about vernacular architecture. First, it was sometimes misunderstood as if it were primitive architecture. However, they outperform so-called modern structures even in the severest conditions. Second, another opinion that vernacular architecture is equivalent to ancient architecture is widespread. Though the building technique must be traditional, the vernacular structures have not solely existed in the past. They are still built and used. A third misconception suggests that vernacular architecture is limited to the rural world. As far as we know, at the beginning of the new millennium, half of the world's population lived in cities and the other half was non-urban. The transformation and modernization process took place earlier in the developed settlements. Vernacular structures are less commonly spotted in cities, but they do exist as well. Each industrial city is an object of migration and has more or less suburban settlements, which are mainly constructed via vernacular principles. The last wrong perception accepts all vernacular structures as residences. Since housing is the only worldwide function among cultures, there is a vast variety to discuss within the study of the field. However, vernacular architecture is not confined to dwellings. It includes outbuildings such as barns, byres, mills, granaries, shrines, meeting places, shops, schools, bazaars, and more, only if they fit the definition. The history of architectural study has traditionally focused on the grandeur of kings, empires, palaces, and temples, often neglecting the value of folk traditions representing the majority. Vernacular architecture, however, stands as a direct and unself-conscious translation of a culture's needs, values, and way of life into physical form. Often disregarded due to its lack of reference to mainstream architectural styles or prevalent theories, vernacular architecture was long ignored, left unrecognized and undocumented. Yet, it embodies how people have lived, worked, and worshipped throughout history, despite being overlooked in the past. Most of the global population continues to rely on vernacular buildings for their daily lives. The last 40 years have seen the academic study of vernacular architecture still mainly on the periphery of architectural history. The names mentioned above, with their definitions, are the pioneers. Bernard Rudolphski's Architecture Without Architect exhibition in 1964, Amos Rappaport's 1969 book House Form and Culture, Paul Oliver's 1969 book Shelter and Society, and 1987 book Dwellings, the House Across the World, the famous Encyclopedia of Vernacular Architecture of the World, edited by Paul Oliver in 1997, and its counterpart Atlas of Vernacular Architecture of the World, co-edited by Paul Oliver, Marcel Vellinga, and Alexander Bridge in 2007, are the major works. Vernacular architecture still needs to be studied in further detail. The 21st century brings a new urgency to studying vernacular architecture, with the now popular sustainability subject serving as a compelling motivation for research. As mentioned, most of the world's structures embody a vernacular identity, many of which have evolved over centuries or even millennia, achieving perfection through countless trial and error adjustments and modifications. These structures, refined over generations, stand as testaments to cumulative human experience and are inherently sustainable, having endured the test of time. However, with the rapid industrialization and urbanization of the Western world, there is an increasing tendency to overlook the importance and complexity of the natural environment. Popular opinion often mistakenly suggests that Western building forms and technologies are universally applicable across all climates and cultures, but this is far from the truth. In an era where physical constraints have been significantly reduced, we can innovate beyond historical limitations, yet ironically, we often act as though our choices are restricted. Vernacular architecture offers a wealth of insights and understanding crucial for addressing these challenges, reminding us of the harmony between built forms, cultural identity, and environmental adaptation. On the other hand, the field must be studied in an interdisciplinary environment that includes geographers, historians, urban designers, interior designers, anthropologists, ethnographers, archaeologists, behavioral scientists, sociologists, conservationists, culturologists, and even experts in local beliefs alongside architects. Vernacular architecture can be misunderstood as mere concrete objects, materials brought together through techniques, unless these abstract design decisions are thoroughly evaluated through the lens of social sciences. Vernacular architecture can also be essential to the education of architects. The present so-called primitive hut studies are generally limited to the first year of schooling, whereas vernacular architecture should be studied in greater depth during the final year. Fortunately, there are now courses and modules titled Vernacular Architecture in many universities worldwide, partially restoring the field's value compared to earlier times. Further studies must be conducted for each distinct world region, as vernacular architecture undoubtedly offers valuable lessons. This is the end of the Vernacular Architecture Chapter 2, the definition of the field. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.